So we're up in the cloud. The cloud used to be just a thing that brought water. Now it's
Yeah.
something that contains all the information in the world. What's that all about?
I don't know, but I keep wondering how pervasive it's going to be.
Yeah, yeah. I was reading your blog recently, and there was an entry in there about artificial intelligence and how that's affecting things in your life. Can you speak to that a little bit?
I think it's affecting everybody at this point. Whether we know it or not is another thing. I wrote a book with AI about AI about 2 months after ChatGPT came out really widely in public a year and a half ago. And ever since then, it's just become even more and more ubiquitous. It's everywhere all the time. And I think the thing that I see is I work with a lot, as a coach, I work with a lot of freelancers and a lot of solopreneur folks who are doing, creative work mostly, a lot of designers and artists and musicians and things like that. And I think the biggest concerns that I have for people who are making that kind of creativity is that AI is a pretty poor substitute for the real thing, and I want to make sure that we don't lose sight of the value of the creative process for humans. And I want there to be some kind of protection for the market value of creative work. And I really feel like that is, the future of the marketable value of creative work is questionable right now.
Yeah. How do you think that any sort of protection can be put in place without long, protracted contractual fighting amongst, unions and so on? I mean, how could you possibly protect creativity?
We don't know yet.
Yeah.
And that's the thing. It's like, all along, the protection of creative work has always been a reactive process rather than a proactive one. And so our copyright laws that are in effect now are basically very similar to the ones that we've had since the early 1900s. They've been updated in some minor ways along the way, but they haven't been able to be updated in a relevant way to protect content creators in the world of AI. And that's where a lot of the fights are happening right now. It's like the different rights organizations for like music performing rights are fighting with AI companies saying, you have to, you either have to pay some kind of a royalty for the work that you're training the AI on, or you can't use it. And so that tension is far from being resolved at this point. But those kinds of fights, I think, are going to be a part of the creative mix for the next little while.
Yeah, absolutely. Just in these first few minutes since the top of the show here when we began, you made mention of a couple of things we both did. I used the word cloud, which means something different now than it used to. And then you used the word coach, which nowadays is completely different than what it used to be. It used to be the guy who had a bunch of little leaguers around the field. And then you use the word solopreneur, which is another brand new coined phrase that never used to be pre-COVID. So let's split this interview into questions between pre-COVID days, the good old days, and now the post-COVID days where words like cloud, AI, solopreneur, and coach is all part of the vernacular. So let's just start with the word coach.
Okay.
Since COVID, it seems everybody, and that includes kids in their 20s, have become life coaches. How is it at the age of 20 something when you have relatively zero experience in life that you could possibly take on the responsibility of wanting to lead someone as their life coach or financial coach?
That's an interesting topic, and it's one that is very interesting to me, primarily because I got into coaching because it was something that I could do, and the bar to entry was pretty low. And that's one of the things that I think is appealing to a lot of people is that there is no licensing that's necessary to call yourself a coach. There's no certification that's necessary to call yourself a coach. Folks who are able to call themselves a coach at a very young age, very often I think they may have had a very positive coaching experience themselves and they've said, hey, I could probably do that too. Or they may have gone ahead and gotten into a program where they did receive some professional training. That's possible too. But coach is a hard term right now because it means so many things. And I was telling somebody the other day, when I got into coaching, I've been doing coaching now since about 2009, 2010, as a thing. And what's really interesting is that I had somebody before that tell me that I would be a really good coach, but the frame of reference that I had for coaching was either I was like Anthony Robbins or I was like one of these executive coaches that works with these really high level corporate executives. And I didn't know what they were talking about. And I thought that is the weirdest thing I've ever been told about myself in my whole life. But what I didn't understand was that the coaching role is more along the lines of, in some ways it's an advisor, but more often than not, it's just kind of a sounding board for a person who is going through some kind of a change or a transition of some kind, or maybe they want to try something new, or maybe they're interested in testing some ideas or whatever. And the coaching role is one that I feel like is kind of equal parts listener, cheerleader, and facilitator. So it's like if somebody comes to me and they're interested in coaching, first big part of it for me is to just really become an explorer with them as to what possibilities they are interested in and what does it take to make those possibilities into reality. And then I help them to facilitate that along the way, and I cheer them on every step of the way. Or in some cases, I have been a discouraging voice in some people's ears, but that's usually when I see something that I'm just concerned about, that it's not being seen as completely as it needs to.
Yeah. I take exception to people who use the term coach to describe themselves. Now, not someone like you who's educated and of a certain age and has had a lot of life experience, so you have much wisdom to share. That's not the issue. It is definitely when a young person wants to present themselves as a coach, perhaps they can find other work or they think that everybody needs help
Yeah.
or whatever, but they really don't possess the life skills and, that life kind of provides us. So definitely I don't take exception to it when an older person wants to present themselves as that, because my guess is that their toolbox is pretty well filled.
That was my experience for sure. I started coaching more out of I didn't even realize what I was doing was coaching until I was headlong into it. And what had happened was that I had gotten really sick, and in my music career, I had to just set it aside completely. It started out with real severe case tendonitis in both arms, and graduated on to become a very life-threatening illness that I battled for a couple of years. During that time, I had to find ways to bring income into my family in whatever way that I could. And one of the things that started to happen was that I had a lot of guitar students at that time, a lot of acquaintances that I knew who were creative people. They were musicians, they were artists, authors, folks like that. And they came to me just looking for any kind of advice that I had about starting their career, or about maybe adding a career to what they were already doing that was in more in their creative realm. And one of the things that I discovered was that I did have resources that were relevant to them, and I was able to help them in meaningful ways. And at first, I wasn't charging anything for it. At first, I didn't realize that, first of all, I didn't call what I was doing coaching, but I had a conversation one day. This lady said, I want to pay you and I want to know how much. And I said, I don't even begin to know how much. And so one of the things that was really interesting was that she used the word coach. And that was the first time that I'd had that dawn on me that what I was doing was actually coaching. And from that point on, I started to pay a little bit more close attention to what the transactions were. I started to learn a lot more about what the coaching business is and what good coaching is. And I started to really take it a lot more seriously at that point.
In your opinion, is a good coach someone who has an excessive amount of empathy, sympathy, techniques that work, or philosophies that work?
It's a combination for sure. I think that a well-rounded coach is someone who takes all of those things into account. The emotional aspect of it, they take the philosophical aspect of it into account. There is a lot of thinking that goes into what we do. And being philosophical about it, I think, is really a central part of it. A big part of what coaching is helping people think through things. And so I think that there has to be some facility with our own thinking process as we come in to help other people do that.
Like I said, I can totally relate to it and understand it and appreciate it when someone like yourself is a coach, but there are a lot of educated derelicts out there, even psychologists and psychiatrists who can't pull it together
Yeah.
when you're face to face with them. And they have all the education and training in the world. But if you don't have the life experiences in your back seat, you really can't help people with that.
I would have the same level of criteria for the car mechanic that I hire. I want this person to be knowledgeable and I want them to get it right the first time.
Right.
I don't want them to make any mistakes on my car.
I want to drill down a little bit into your background in music.
Okay.
You played with a band for a while. Can you describe not only the instrument, I guess it was guitar that you played, but the type and style of music and the type and style of audiences that you attracted?
My music career was a long, strange trip, to be sure. And
Was
it,
that great, very Grateful Dead of you?
well, it turns out that line applies to my life probably better than any other in any kind of written form. I always tell people that my resume is a train wreck and my career has been a long, strange trip. Um, and both of them are probably included in at least 12 folk songs. My music career was one that I look at it as very experimental because I got to try a lot of stuff. When I started out in high school, music was just a way for me to actually just be somebody in the room. I wasn't a good athlete. I wasn't a good student. I wasn't anybody that anybody wanted to know. And music became a way of being recognized among my peer group. And so that was really the value of it for me when I was starting out 14 and 15 years old. It was just a way to be somebody. There was something to attach to my name that they could then associate in a positive way.
Did it help you also get babes?
Sadly, no. I was still one of the loneliest guys in the world. And one of the things is that I'm a pretty introverted guy. And back then I was very timid. I was not an outgoing person unless I already knew somebody. I wasn't very outgoing at all. So music gave me a way of being a much more public person that was safe. It was a safe way to be because it wasn't too draining or taxing or anything like that. But I had some teachers along the way that were extremely influential and remarkable to me. And what ended up happening was that they gave me opportunities that were in the realm of jazz guitar. And that became my passion for the next probably 10 or 12 years was just learning everything that I could about guitar and in particular jazz guitar. I also had some classical lessons during that time and I always had rock and roll as a backdrop. I grew up with AM radio and then FM radio, and I listened to the radio pretty constantly all the time until I had a car with my own tape player in it, an 8-track tape player for those of you of a certain age. But the thing that was really always interesting to me is music was always something I could always find something to explore with music. And I never had any kind of limits as far as kinds of music that were allowed. It was like I always wanted to try everything that I could. And so I had that freedom to do that. Now, I graduated from college with a degree in music and business. I wanted to move to Nashville and be a professional songwriter, be involved in the music publishing industry. That path wasn't to be. And I tried to make it happen a couple of times over, and I just did not find that path to be an open door for me. But what ultimately became the open door for me was songwriting. And ultimately, you talk about life experience, and I kind of I see my coaching and my songwriting careers unfolding in a parallel way because the songwriting was a way for me to process what was going on internally. It was a way for me to kind of put things outside of myself so that I could actually look at what was going on instead of going through all of these overwhelming feelings that I was having.
Right.
And so songwriting then became really the main focus. And I was a solo singer songwriter for the majority of the years that I was full time. And then I was in bands as well, just always as the hired gun guitar player.
So was that like session work or was that live stuff?
Early on, it was session work, but the session work kind of went away as technology developed. I was not, I wasn't one of the best players in the area, and so I would get called for, I would get called for like the Earthworm Farm radio jingle gig, you know, those kinds of things. They were fun, but they were not very memorable. But I liked studio music a lot, but I found that I really loved the creative process of writing songs and producing those original songs. Those two things really became the heartbeats of my music passion.
And in what genre were you a specialist or what felt right to you? What would you describe yourself as?
I get compared to the Johns a lot. Johnny Cash, John Prine, John Lennon, John Hartford, if any of you know who he is. The Johns are the ones that I get most favorably compared to in my own songwriting and my own style. But I've done a lot of production for a lot of different kinds of musicians.
It's not a bad group to be associated with. I got to
No,
be honest, you know.
I'm not complaining a bit. They're all
Yeah.
at the top of my list.
Who are some of your favorite artists? You can go back as far as you want.
That's always a hard one because I have so many and they're from all corners. I was influenced a lot by the Beatles early on. British invasion kind of coincided with my early childhood. And so that was the music that I grew up with. I mean, those are the earliest songs that I can remember are things like the Beatles and the Association and Beach Boys, and some of those bands were the earliest ones that really imprinted on me. And those are the ones that I still go back to and I still get goosebumps from. When I was more in high school, I started to get more into bands that were a little bit more progressive, like Rush and Yes. I was a huge fan of Peter Frampton when Frampton Comes Alive came out. Another band. There were two other bands that I would say during that time that I listened to incessantly, and one of them was Kiss. They weren't the greatest musicians and songwriters, but they were entertaining. They made it fun and spectacular and interesting. And then the other band that I listened to constantly during that time was Heart. I felt like Heart was writing some of the most interesting music in rock and roll at that time. And
Oh yeah.
what's really funny is I never really got into like Led Zeppelin very much or Bad Company or any of those kind of second wave of British bands.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure why. That just really that kind of stymies me because they're really interesting and they're really cool. But there was just something that I don't know that I resonated with it.
It might have been that kind of folksy background that you have, or something internal. You
Yeah.
notice, you know, when you were mentioning that the Beatles were a big influence on you, it sort of reminds me of sports. Like either you're a Yankees fan or you're a Mets fan, and when it goes back to the Beatles, either you're a Beatles fan or a Stones
Stones.
fan. Did you find yourself having at odds with that, with a lot of people who like were Stones were number one, and you were more about the Beatles?
Well, I think what was really interesting within the Beatles, I think there were two Beatles whose songs really resonated with me the most. Paul McCartney's songs, I think, especially around the time of like Sergeant Pepper and the White Album, the songs that he was writing during that time, I just felt were some of the best things that he's ever written and some of the best things that have ever been written, period. I was a little bit too young to really be on the Bob Dylan bandwagon. And what's really funny is that I really didn't discover Bob Dylan and appreciate him until I started writing my own songs later on. And the same could be true for people like John Prine and people like that. But the other Beatle that I really resonated with was George Harrison. And I just loved his music. Here Comes the Sun and Blackbird are two songs that I do every time that I play.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and I've when I was playing full time, they would be every time that I got my guitar out of the case, those two songs would be included in the set.
There are a lot of people who are listening or watching us, I'm sure, right now, who kind of fit into the, if not an audiophile kind of category, at least people who love the sound of vinyl versus the digital sound. Maybe that's kind of not so prevalent anymore, but do you fit into that category?
What's really funny, I grew up in a town in Wyoming that had one radio station and it played everything. It played country music, it played top 40 music, it played easy listening music, it played Lawrence Welk, it played everything. And so I had this mix of music that I listened to as a kid that was just really whatever was on the radio was what I was hearing.
Oh, yeah.
At nighttime, we would pick up this 50,000 watt station in Oklahoma City called KOMA, and we could pick that up after dark. It's some weird physical property of AM waves after dark are able to broadcast further. And KOMA was playing like Alice Cooper and Steely Dan and stuff like that. And so that was when I started to listen a lot more selectively to what would be like pop and rock bands and stuff like that. So when you were talking about the Beatles versus the Stones, it's really interesting to me. I didn't have an appreciation for the Stones until I was older. But the Beatles were a band that I could appreciate even at a younger age. They had
Hmm.
like Yellow Submarine came out and that was one of my favorite records when I was a kid. I was probably 7 years old, maybe 6 or 7 years old.
Wow.
And so I listened to that album and I memorized every word of it. So the Stones weren't doing things like that. They were doing things like Satanic Majesty's Request and, some of those crazy things, 19th Nervous Breakdown and Mama's Little Helper and, those kinds of songs, which weren't appropriate for a 6-year-old to be listening
Right.
to.
Exactly.
So I didn't appreciate the Stones again. The Stones and Dylan, I came back to when I was older, and I appreciated them a lot more as an older person.
So, you were talking about the Stones.
Yeah.
Is it amazing that this guy is still bopping and bouncing around in his 80s?
And I marvel anybody who can play rock and roll past 60.
Right. I mean, like, oi, my shoulder. And so just getting out of bed is tough enough. You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
It's just it really is remarkable. And Keith Richards has not been the image of public health. And here he is out there just still slinging it every night. And I mean, that's one of the things that I think is really interesting to look at is that they have created a way to stay active and engaged in the business, according to their own terms for as long as they want to, which is
Right.
just in today's age, that is a remarkable thing.
It really is. Are you still listening to music these days? And if so, is it music from back in the 90s or 80s or earlier?
No, I don't listen to music as much. I still write some songs and I still record a little bit here and there. My son, you were talking about vinyl. I have an 18-year-old son and he's way into death metal, but he's also into vinyl. And what he asked for Christmas was a turntable. And he has discovered the joy of the sound quality of that nice, warm analog sound. And he still buys CDs. He's kind of an outlier, I think, but he loves going to record stores. And so he's the one person in our family that still faithfully listens to recorded music on a physical medium.
I know, isn't that pretty wild?
It's awesome as far as I'm concerned, and I'm not going to discourage it.
And they still have record stores that are not just vintage stores these days?
Well, it's hard to find them. I think if he wants anything new, there are a couple of stores that he will travel to one that's about 20 minutes south of us and one that's about an hour north of us. And they do carry some new titles that he's interested in, but most of the stores that he goes to are selling used records. He also buys a lot directly from artists. So he goes to a lot
Oh,
of
yeah.
concerts and he buys things directly from them if he can.
Were you ever a fan of the Rat Pack and the people back then and the crooners and all of that? I know that that's before our time, but still some of their music was pretty great, wasn't it?
Oh my God, it was great. And that, I was talking about the radio station in that little town that I lived in Wyoming. Sinatra and Dean Martin and, Bing Crosby were all on that. I remember one of the first 45 albums I had was Sammy Davis Jr. singing The Candyman. So yeah, I grew up with the Rat Pack and the Rat Pack, and
Right.
that was a different animal. But yeah, that whole era, my dad had a lot of records from people like he had Chet Atkins, which back then, what was really interesting to me was that Chet Atkins was considered more of a jazz crossover artist in the 50s than he was a straight country artist. He was producing a lot of country albums, but the people who listened to him were actually they tended to be a little bit more on the jazz side of things.
Hmm.
And that was another thing that I found very interesting was that back in the 50s, the record companies were able to cross those lines in a much easier way than they've had ever since then. So you could have somebody like Ray Charles who could then record an album of country and Western songs, and it would become a best-selling album of the year, right?
Yeah.
Those kinds of experiments were happening in the 50s and early 60s. And my dad had a lot of those records. He also had a lot of records from like the Kingston Trio, Louis Prima.
Oh,
So those were the things that my dad had. My mom is a classical pianist. So at the same time that my dad had all of those kind of contemporary things that were going on back in the 50s and early 60s, my mom had all of the classics, Beethoven, Chopin, Schubert. And I just grew up with that kind of a mix. Mom, as a concert pianist, she practiced all the time. When had 5 minutes to herself, she was at the piano. I tell people that if you want to put me to sleep, just play classical piano music for me because that was what I fell asleep to almost every night as a kid growing up. So I just had this just incredible mix of music to listen to. Now, when I listen to music, I'm just as likely to just turn on one of the streaming services and just let it go on autopilot and just
based on
see.
your playlist and your tastes, or are you into the more modern music as well?
I listen to all of it.
Do
And
you
there's some
really?
modern of it. There's some modern music that I just really, really love. I think there's some songwriters out there right now that are just incredible. I wish they would get a better I wish that they would get a better level of visibility than they are, but there's still there's amazing music being made everywhere right now. And it's so accessible. It's hard to find silence is really the trick now.
When you're talking about visibility a moment ago, it reminded me of the old days. I used to be in talk radio and always around radio stations. And back in the day, you needed to have your music played by radio stations to be able to sell your albums. And
Yeah.
that's how people grew their business and did their marketing. Nowadays, it's all about the social media, is it not?
It's largely about the connections that you have directly with your fans, and social media can play a big part in that. I think email is a big part of it. The areas where I see musicians doing really well are places like YouTube. If you can get a following on YouTube, that right now, I think is probably the biggest feather that any musician can have in their cap is if they have a loyal following of people who listen to them on YouTube or watch their videos. Um, I think radio has changed so much in the last 20 years since the 90s, back when Clinton signed in the broadcasting bill that allowed broadcast conglomerates to buy up as many properties as they could. And all of radio and television got centralized for the most part. That changed a lot about how music was discovered. And then, on the other hand, we've got the internet now that makes music really easy to discover, but it makes it really difficult to curate. And that was one of the things that radio did really well, especially in its heyday before the broadcast amendment came out. And before, back when you had independent radio stations, those
Right.
programmers, they were choosing their list and they were curating for you. And it's like if you knew the programmer and you liked their list, you listened to their show and the advertisers loved it, and it's like that went away largely. So now what you've got is a focus group in St. Louis that's choosing the music for the entire US.
It's funny that you mentioned YouTube because that's how you and I found each other a
Yeah.
couple years back. A friend of mine, Gail, I won't use her last name, but she's a dear friend from back when the earth was cooling, who suggested that I watch you because I was asking some technical questions because here I am, a little baby content creator wanting to learn the ins and outs. And she happens to be a videographer. So she probably knows a lot about that stuff. And yet she said, you should watch Franklin Taggart because you had done some instructionals and so on. And I kind of got hooked on you. And a few years ago, I think I contacted you and said,
Yeah.
hey, my friend Gail mentioned you and I've been watching you and I've become a fan of yours. And so you've been on YouTube now for a number of years. I'm new to it. And just as you were saying, if you can get the following on YouTube, you can probably grow into almost any area that you want. Is that right?
I think it's helpful. And YouTube is still a place where it's possible to form a following without having to pay to boost your posts to be seen. The other social media platforms will let you reach like 3% of the people who've already signed up to follow you. And to reach any more than that, you have to pay for it.
Mm-hmm.
YouTube is the exception to that rule. And as long as you are able to encourage people to subscribe to your channel, the likelihood that they'll see what you have put out is higher than anywhere else.
Right.
I feel like that YouTube is still, as far as creators are concerned, I still think that it's one of the more friendly platforms out there. It's changed a lot in the last few years, but everything's changed in the last few years. I don't want to be misleading. It's like I have been kind of an idiot savant on YouTube as far as the way that I've used it. I have not, I've not been very strategic. I've been this kind of person, like if I figured out something for myself and I think, oh, I should make a video about that. I'll
Right.
just post it. But I'm not that kind of animal that is going out there trying to get as many YouTube followers and as many viewing hours as I can. I just want to share things that are interesting, and that's it.
That's worked well for you, right?
So far, so good, and I'm happy with it. It's again, the thing that is most rewarding for me is the intrinsic creativity, and beyond that, it's boring. Anything that
Right.
has to do with analytics or anything like that, I'm sorry, my eyes are already glazing over just at the word. I'm not interested, but I am interested in the creative process and putting out things that, what's really funny is that video that you were talking about
Yeah.
has been my most popular video on YouTube.
Is
And at
that
this
right?
point, it's pushing like, I think it's around 16,000 views right now.
That's amazing.
It was totally a fluke. It was just one of those things where I thought, I just did this for myself. I'll make a video.
And that video, I believe if it's the one that you're referencing right now, is the one where you can make an overlay to where we each have our box inside of the interview as people will be viewing us now.
Yeah. I was just noticing like when I was doing my podcast on Zoom, those two black bars, the black bar on top and the black bar on the bottom are, like if you were to go into a grocery store and that much space was available and it wasn't filled with some kind of marketing material, you would wonder about the business model of that store. And I just thought, I could do something with that. I could do something with that. And so what I ended up doing was just creating this overlay that has information about websites and offers and things like that on that goes over the top of the Zoom screen so that the windows are still visible through the screen, but you can then have all of the space on top and all of the space on the bottom to encourage people to go to a website or to know about a product or to listen to another episode or to promote whoever my guest was. All of those kinds of things became much more possible with that overlay. Now what I'm waiting for is for Zoom to allow it during the broadcast so that it doesn't have to be added in the editing after the fact.
So tell me if you've recognized this. This is going to sound perhaps negative, and it is, but what attracts me to doing YouTube is being able to have stimulating and engaging conversations with wonderful people like yourself. That's what turns me on. That's what gets me going. I'm
Yeah.
not doing this to monetize, although to be honest, that would be great if that happens someday, but I can't make that, I can't push that. But I can have great conversations with people like you. And I compare and contrast these kinds of conversations with fascinating folks with the girls who are just shaking their torsos and getting, hundreds of thousands or millions of subscribers and views. And there's not a lot of brain power that's put in that. Do you respect people who go for content that is going to explode their audience just based on X or things like that instead of people who are using their brains? Does that sound like a bitter old man? Or tell me your thoughts.
Well, I have mixed reviews. I think the fact that someone with absolutely no talent at all can make thousands of dollars a month doing short videos on TikTok, YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, and then sending people to a site like OnlyFans where people pay $5 a month to see more of their bits than what they can show on the social medias. I think for somebody that really is not, you know, gifted in any other way, more power to them.
More power to us because they have been able to market themselves and their bits to
Yeah.
paying customers.
And the paying customers don't seem to be going away.
Right,
So
right.
the thing is, it's like, political realm right now that those kinds of things are, on the blog, but who's going to watch? Who knows? I don't want to
Right.
talk about that. However, what I do want to say is that I think that same thing has been in existence since the earliest forms of content, because I I know that in some of the archaeological finds, the thing that they find along with the religious iconography are the sexual position drawings and paintings and things like that. And I look at like all the different things like in ancient Greece underneath the Colosseum, there were booths that were made for sex.
So,
So
like glory hole booths beneath the Colosseum?
yeah. And so it's like
Wow.
in public places, there were these places that people could get that particular jolly satisfied. And that has been the case for humans in every medium, every step of the way through all of history, right? I remember when cable came out and pay-per-view was a thing.
Yeah.
If you had the money, you could do pay-per-view and you could get as much nudity as you wanted any time of day or night.
Go
And
Cinemax.
and I remember, even at the higher class magazine shops when I was a kid, there were always the magazines that were covered with brown paper and adults could buy them. And these were in mainstream bookstores and magazine shops. So the thing that I'll say is that this is just the next version of the peep show.
Right.
And that has been a part of humanity for as long as civilization has been around. And I'm not going to hold it against anybody for their ingenuity to say, you know what? I found an easy way to make thousands of dollars a month. I'm not going to discourage that at all. Now, one thing that I will say is that I'm disgusted with platforms like Facebook, especially because that kind of content is predominant in what they show you. And so when you go on your feed now on Facebook, you're not seeing your friends, you're seeing things that have been paid for and published and shorts that are leading to, Facebook making money from the deal. And so that's the thing that I have more of a difficulty with, is that they built that platform on our backs, on our data, and now they are feeding us only things that are being paid for and not the things that we've actually signed up for.
Interesting point. Are they feeding us the things that we have shown interest in? Is it algorithm based, or are they just showing you things that don't even fit into your likes and dislikes?
I haven't been able to make any rhyme or reason out of it.
Hmm.
Um, The thing that's really tricky about the algorithm is that the algorithm, especially on smartphones, measures how long you stop on an image. And so the thing that's really interesting is like they put those images out there that have a real scantily clad person doing their dance, and that's the first image that you see. Well, naturally, the scroll is going to stop there longer. So it's even before you had a chance to even look at it, you've already been there for the fraction of a second that the algorithm needs to say that that's something that you're going to be interested in. Now, the only way that you can actually change any of that is to actually take some specific steps with the content and go up in the upper right-hand corner of your content. There are usually a series of three dots, and you can click on those and say, I want to see more of this or I want to see less of this.
Right.
Who's got the time to curate their own feed? What I have found, though, Facebook does do this, but they don't advertise it. They actually have a function on the phone where you can actually call up a specific feed. And one of the feeds that they have is your friend feed. And so what you'll see is all of the posts that your friends have done within the last period of time. That is one of the ways that you can actually feed your algorithm is to spend time
Oh,
on the friend feed and spend time with your friends' actual content.
it sounds a lot more rewarding to be able to do that. So is that on the mobile Facebook or is that on the desktop Facebook?
If you're on the mobile, you have to go to your page. You have to go to your profile, and there's a tab there that says feeds. And when you click on that tab, there are other feeds that pop up there, groups, ads, friends, music, videos, whatever, reels. And the one that is entitled friends is all from accounts that you follow.
That's very good to know. So that's on the mobile, you're saying, not just Facebook, be it mobile or PC, right?
I've never tried it on the PC. On the PC, I actually have my PC set up so that my browser bookmark goes to the groups feed rather than to my main feed because I don't want to see
Uh-huh.
the main feed at all. That's not even interesting remotely to me.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I'd like to know more about that for sure. Maybe you can do a new video on that.
Maybe again, I should just, I should have a video going on for my whole life and then just,
You know, they've talked about that. It's not even science fiction. They're
I
talking
know.
about people wearing selfie cams or whatever to be able to follow and watch and see what they're doing for the rest of their lives.
I tell my clients that you need to document as much of your process as you can because
Hmm.
your process is valuable and people are interested in it. So if there's any way that you can capture it, video is especially popular right now, but even if it's just, you talking into a microphone and saying, these are the steps that I took, this was the platform that I worked on. You can see the result at the link in the description. Even if you're documenting with that much, that's great. I'm still a big fan of blogs, and I was talking to a friend this morning about Substack and how much I've been enjoying Substack.
Are you posting to Substack with
Not
your
yet.
blog, or is your blog separate from that?
My blog is still just on my website. I only
Right.
have a blog. I don't even really have a legit website. FranklinTaggart.com is my blog, and that's the blog that I've been doing the longest. I think I've had 17 blogs over the course of the years that I've been involved in it. At one point, blogging was all I was doing for money. But the blog that I've got right now, I send people there from social media and places like that as long as I'm still allowed to. But I'm really starting to consider Substack as a way to foster a more intentional community that are all interested in talking about some of the same things. And what I would actually like to do is to create a Substack that is more of a community contributor kind of a thing where people who are interested in the same topic and are that are talking about the same thing have a forum to share with each other.
And somehow those people obviously would have a longer attention span than the rest of us.
What's really interesting is that I don't buy the short attention span thing. I think people have an attention span for anything that stays interesting. And I can watch 9 shows in a row of Bridgerton in one sitting and not move because I'm so captivated by the storyline. And there are some people that are going to listen to me say that and they're going to say, "What is wrong with you?" But the thing
Right.
is like I don't have an attention span problem when it comes to something that is interesting to me.
So you don't think that the whole attention span thing is in part due to the fact that the algorithm has created this kind of constant scrolling type of activity? And like if it's not going to interest someone in a tenth of a second, so they can watch it for 3 seconds, don't you think that contributes to what I'm proposing?
No, I think that the attention span argument is overblown. What I think is actually happening is that our
Hmm.
ability to filter information is speeding up. And so what's happening is we're able to see things that are interesting to us immediately and stop on the things that are interesting.
Yeah.
And our filters have just gotten that much more sensitive.
I wanted to ask you about the over your left shoulder on the back wall. You have a whole bunch of different color eyeglass frames. And it's my understanding, I think, based on our last conversation, that you will wear certain colored frames dependent upon your mood of the day. So today you are wearing what looks like silver or gray frames. So please describe your mood and your decision to make that choice to wear today.
These glasses are funny. My wife calls them Bakelite glasses because they look like the Bakelite mixing bowls that she had that were her grandmother's. They're the same color as those
Right.
Bakelite mixing bowls. So I've always called these my Bakelite glasses. They're kind of a pale aqua green kind of a thing. And um, they, I don't know, they are really probably, for me, the ones that I wear when I'm feeling the most at ease and relaxed.
Oh, that's good. I'm going to take that as a compliment.
Oh yeah, man. I've been looking forward to this since we talked about it. And I've been so excited. Our last conversation was just lovely. And so
I so enjoyed that. I was just looking forward to this myself. So, Franklin Taggart, yeah, baby. So, I can't believe we've gone this deep into the show, and I haven't even asked you, Franklin, what have you eaten today?
oh my gosh. Anybody who is from within a 150-mile radius of Cincinnati will understand immediately what I'm going to say. I had a three-way.
Oh, geez, that sounds a little bit kind of risque and saucy, my friend.
Well, if you know Skyline Chili, you know what a three-way is. Skyline Chili is a Cincinnati chili place, and Cincinnati chili is different from any other kind of chili you've ever had, and it's one of my favorite things. So I had a three-way, which was Cincinnati chili, spaghetti, and cheese.
Oh, baby.
Yeah,
Now,
man.
before we continue to speak about food for you, I want to explain to the audience that Cincinnati chili, I believe, because I have to taste everything. And years ago, when I was running Hawaii food tours, we had guests from Cincinnati who were on the tour. And they said, "Have you ever tried Cincinnati chili?" And I said, "No." So the next thing I know, in the mail, they had sent me a bunch of different types of Cincinnati chili. And it's my belief that Cincinnati chili is flavored and spiced with things like cinnamon
Yes.
and baking spices. So it's not your typical chili powder, hot, spicy kind of
No.
Texas or California chili. Can you speak to that a little bit?
The Cincinnati chili story, as I understand it, is much more of a Mediterranean story than anything else. The folks who brought the recipe over, it was a meat sauce that was, handed down from their generations. It has cloves, cinnamon. It still has some tomato base in it. It is a meat chili. There's usually ground beef in it, and there's a kind of a sweet flavor to it. And it usually is served over pasta, and it's usually served with cheese and raw onions and oyster crackers. But as I understand it, the origins of it are more probably Mediterranean, Greek, and that part of the world.
It's very interesting. It's sort of like a kind of chili you would have on a chili dog. So it's more like a sauce than it is a chunky chili, right?
Yep. The chili dogs, the Cincinnati chili dogs are some of the best things in the world for me. I just love those things.
How many different ways can you do that?
Coney dog, or just how many different ways can you serve the chili?
Right, because you said you had a three-way earlier,
Yeah.
spaghetti, cheese, and chili. How many different ways does one ever go? What would be the ultimate amount of ways?
Well, if you're going to be like religious about it, it goes from two to five. If you just want one, it's just the chili. If you want two, it's chili on spaghetti. If you want three, you add cheese. If you want four, you add onions. And if you want five, you add your oyster crackers on top.
Mm.
So the five way is usually the biggest that you can go. Now, you also can get a coney, and the coney is usually it's a small hot dog. It's not, if I remember right, it's not a full size hot dog. It's like a little half frank,
Uh-huh.
and it is on a short bun, smothered with skyline chili and cheese. You can get onions on it if you want to, but it is a treat.
Frank in which you speak, is that a beef frank or a mixed meat or like a fantasy frank? Do we know what that is?
I've never taken the time to actually look into it, but
Uh-huh.
based on the cuisine, I would bet on either beef or pork.
Okay, because we do food around here a lot, bro.
Yeah, man, that's your whole vibe.
It's like hopefully it's not my whole vibe.
But it's like it's central.
Right. Oh, very central. So I think just after hearing you speak about that, the four-way would be my choice.
Yeah.
And I must say to the folks out there, the first time you taste Cincinnati chili, it's going to be odd, but then it becomes oddly satisfying.
Oh yeah.
So that was kind of like the genesis of my experience.
My experience was love at first taste. I just
No kidding.
I I couldn't get enough of it. I thought it was the greatest thing.
Now you had it as a child though, so I didn't try it until way down the line.
Well, actually, I was in college the first time I had it.
Oh,
I had a roommate that lived outside of Cincinnati, and they took me to Skyline. It was the first time I'd ever had it, and I just thought, "Oh my gosh, I want cases of this."
it's completely unusual. And no one makes that, do they? Or do
Yeah,
people, they do make it. Okay, so we're going to have to get some recipes for Cincinnati chili
you can
posted into the
actually.
show notes.
Oh, there are some really great recipes online.
Uh-huh.
I think one of the ones that I found was published in the New York Times several years ago. But I found that, and that's the closest that I've found that comes to. There are two companies in Cincinnati that are really well known. One of them is called Gold Star, and the other one is called
Mhm.
Skyline. You can find Skyline chili in most supermarkets now throughout the country. I
Oh,
find canned Skyline chili in my local King Superstore, and I know that you can also buy it on Amazon. So,
oh, okay. Those were the two brands that was sent to me originally.
oh, is that right? Skyline and Gold Star?
Yeah, 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 yeah. And I
Yeah.
remember there was a difference, but I don't remember the nuanced difference at all.
I find Skyline to be a little bit sweeter.
Uh-huh.
Gold Star, I think, has a tendency to be a little bit more savory, kind of a more of a salty flavor, if I remember right. It's a little bit spicier too, if I remember right. It's been a
Mm.
while since I had Gold Star. Skyline, I still buy a can every now and then just for old time's sake.
So, in anticipation of being on 50 Tastes of Grey, you went full on. You had your Cincinnati chili. What would be a typical day of food for Franklin Taggart?
I live with the chef,
Uh-huh.
and she's Italian. And so very frequently our dishes tend to be in kind of three categories: meat in three, the one pot meal, and the pasta that you should have in every situation that you can for the rest of
Right.
your life. Um,
Okay.
my wife is just an absolutely phenomenal cook, and so I have a tendency to be the breakfast cook around the house, and she has a tendency to handle the real creative things. But we eat really well around here.
What are a couple of mama's favorite dishes that you just go wild for?
One we had most recently that was just absolutely over the top was rigatoni,
Oh,
baked rigatoni with ricotta cheese, and it was like had 2 pounds of pasta and 4 pounds of cheese in that thing. It was just god awfully rich, and it was so good. And we had that served with Italian sausage and marinara sauce, and that was just over the top.
I love the way that your face was just expressing all those words. Your eyes were rotating in different directions, and you were having a good time recalling that dish.
We still have a little bit of the sauce in the freezer, and I'm thinking really seriously about going and defrosting it right now.
You have inspired me to go and pick up the ingredients and make an eggplant parm.
Oh my gosh, that sounds nice too.
Tell your wife now.
Um,
What is her name, by the way?
Her name is Monica Corrado,
And is
and
she Is she an instructor at this point?
She's been teaching nutrition and cooking techniques for 20 years.
Hmm.
She teaches a couple of specific diets. One of them is called the Gut and Psychology Syndrome diet. Then the other one is one that's affiliated with a movement called the traditional food movement called Nourishing Traditions. And she specializes in both of those.
Very interesting. The gut one has probably a lot to do with fermented products. Am I right?
Fermentation is one of the four cornerstones of that one,
You bet.
definitely.
Oh, she and I would have a lot in common.
You'd love to talk to her too, man. We ought to
Let's
set
get her
that
on the horn right
conversation up.
now.
Wonder if she's even here.
You're pretty fortunate that you have a chef in the family. Like my wife is very fortunate she has a chef in the family.
Well, yeah. Anybody who has a chef in proximity is a fortunate soul.
Right, right. We are the true people pleasers.
And we learn how to deal with the quirks, but it's worth every moment.
You mean the quirks of the chefs?
Yes.
Uh-huh.
Yes. It's like, the TV shows are not inaccurate when it comes to the demeanor of a professional in the kitchen.
Are you referring to my OCD, Franklin?
It
Please
could be
tell me.
OCD, and it could be that you just have your routine and you don't want anybody to interfere with that. And so
Right.
you have your way of moving people around to the places that they are out of your way.
That's so funny. It's like nobody comes into my kitchen. And I'm a pretty warm and fuzzy guy in real life, but like in the kitchen, please do not enter.
That's where your boundaries are.
Right, right. You know, you have to have some in life, right?
That's what I keep hearing.
So do you ever just refer to Monica and say, baby, I feel like X, Y, or Z? Or is it always just do your thing, baby?
The majority of the time, it's chef, whatever you say.
Oh,
Um, and
okay. So
then,
you're a fan of The Bear.
what's really funny is we started watching that and she couldn't watch it because it was so uncomfortable.
Oh my gosh.
Um,
Tell me about it. I've cried like a little schoolgirl watching that show, but I love it. It's so
yeah,
extremely well done and written.
too close to home. She was saying she couldn't take the tension of it. So I'm putting that on my list to watch in the later hours.
Yep. It's a good thing to do. And for people of a certain age, like because I was at over 1,000 concerts as a kid, because I traveled with the Eagles and Pink
Yeah.
Floyd and those folks. I've seen so many concerts that I have moderate to severe high end hearing loss. So to hear dialogue on shows, I need to have, an earbud or a monitor going on so I can catch the dialogue.
I'm I'm somewhat similar. I would prefer to listen to it through ear pods now than to
Yeah.
have the speaker on because the speaker just doesn't capture it the way that I need to hear it.
Right. And the whole neighborhood doesn't need to hear your TV blaring.
That's a fact.
Oh, okay. So you've got the food thing pretty well covered.
Dang, man, I am not complaining one bit.
Yeah. Have you ever thought about being able to go back in time? And if so, if you could go back in time, Franklin, knowing what you know now, would you be willing to kill baby Hitler?
Oh man. Oh, that's a hard question. Would I have to know what he was going to become?
Yeah, yeah. Like I said, knowing what you know now, if you were able to go back in time, would you kill baby Hitler?
No.
No. And do you want to expound on that or is it done?
Well, as much as I would like to say that uh, I still believe that thou shalt not kill is an important principle to live by.
Hmm.
And I have to tell you, I'm just as human as anybody else, and that includes homicidal tendencies that I don't act on
Right.
and disappointment when certain people aren't killed. But what I would say is that if I could go further back, I would probably find some way to either help his father be a better person or to interfere in the pregnancy.
Franklin Taggart, AKA IUD man.
Yeah, probably. I don't know. That's probably
Okay.
just as invasive, but it does the job without the murder.
I love those kinds of questions because they are just so difficult to answer and to be appropriate with answers on those. So
Yeah.
that's why I laid that on you.
Well, it makes things interesting now, doesn't it? And
Yeah,
hopefully somebody will get to the point in the show and say, "Oh, I need to hold on for that one."
right. How do we determine what is ethically right in a multicultural society?
That's a great question, and I don't know that we'll ever actually have a clear, concise answer that satisfies everyone. But I think one of the things that we've got to look at is that the majority of civilizations do have some kind of a moral impulse, some kind of an agreement on what is acceptable and what is not. And it's interesting to me to see how many of those lines tend to cross when you compare them side by side.
Right. Right. And also, we're seeing that normal today is not what normal 30 years ago was.
Totally different.
So, how does that change? Why does that change if fundamentally they're the same thing?
I think one of the things that we've got to understand is that we're an evolving species and everything about us is evolving. And the way that we live in the world is not something that was determined thousands of years ago. Now, certainly there are certain parts of our makeup that are determined, that we are a biological being. Biology and the DNA and the genetics are set up to work in certain ways. Yes, that is true. And we're also a learning species. We are able to be highly conditioned through education from the earliest age until we die. And so one of the things that's there is that the possibilities legitimately for humanity are endless for the ways that we can be with each other. And one of the things that we've got to keep coming back to is what kind of world do we want? Do we want to have a world that has to be dominated by a ruling class that thinks that they are absolutely right about everything? Or can we live in that world that respects cultures and allows people to live by what they believe is right and true? That remains to be seen.
Hmm.
We're at a precarious time in that the side of things that wants to have authoritarian power is much more highly organized than the other side right now.
That's very true.
And they have been for years, for decades. And we are seeing the fruit of decades of intentional work on the part of that group of people to take over the government.
Yeah, they talk about playing the long game, and apparently that happens within our own environment, not necessarily on another country towards
Yeah.
us.
So the
Yeah.
thing that I think is really interesting is like, we have to still find ways to get past situations like this in a way that doesn't decimate the whole race. Our survival depends on it. We also know that we live on a planet that's going to be sucked into a star at some point in the billion-year future. And so, hope is something that is extraordinarily temporary for any of us.
Mentioned a few minutes ago about education. What is your personal standing on the system that calls itself education? And do you believe that it's positive or negative? Is it happening, or is it better maybe to be homeschooled and to learn through hard knocks?
That's a great question. I struggle with terminology like the system because it's a way of generalizing something that's a pretty complex thing. And it's a way of simplifying and saying that it's all the system's fault. Well, the system is not something that exists independent of people.
Like the government.
Yeah, the government
Right.
is not independent of people. And, the military industrial complex is not independent of people. People are doing these things. And so one of the things that I've got to look at, in the educational space is the things that we need to know are changing. 100 years ago, the system that we've got right now for education worked really well to prepare people for an industrial or an agricultural kind of a situation, or it prepared people to be teachers, nurses, doctors, and specialists in those areas. But what we've got right now is a scene where, like, my kid just graduated from high school, and college to him, you can see him struggle with the decision, does it really make sense to do that? And even though, there's some social interest in going, and we certainly value it, and we want him to get the highest education that he can get, because opportunity seems to follow education in some ways. It's not as true as it used to be, but I can see him going through and saying, do I have to be educated that way in order to have the life that I want? And I think that that's really one of the things that we're looking at. I think one of the people that I've been interested to hear in the conversation around education is Seth Godin. Now, Seth Godin is more often associated with marketing and business, but he's got some really well-formed opinions about education, in that the way that we educate ourselves and the way that we educate our kids at this point is well beyond out of date and irrelevant. And we've got to find different ways. And one of the things that he talks about is that, our university system right now is in more of a self-protection mode than it is in an innovation mode. And so what they're doing is they're building all of these huge funds, but those funds aren't being used to improve education. They're being used to get more funds,
It's not turning out the best and the brightest, which is, I think, my pet peeve with whether we call it the system or not. It's become politicized like
Yeah.
everything else. And I think that ruins a lot.
I think one of the things that's really interesting is that as far as information is concerned, we are living in a time when you can have access to any information that you want at any time, just by, at this point, just tapping on your phone.
Right at the end of your arm, you've got all the information in the world.
That is being adapted now to be in your eyeglasses, and it will be at some point adapted to be a chip in your body. And so one of the things that we've then got to say is, okay, all of the information is there. Now, the education isn't about information. It's about what are the needs that we need to be able to address here, and how do we effectively take all of the resources that we have and meet those needs effectively.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the things that we've got to look at. So how do we educate ourselves, and how do we educate our future generations to be able to do that? Now, the thing that's really exciting is the technology actually allows us to shorten the time of our response by incredible increments. It's crazy. I can just use an example of back when you had to do a research paper in college. You took a whole semester and you went to the library several times a week. You used the Dewey Decimal System and you used the card catalog to find whatever resources that you could find. You went to the microfiche machine and you looked at every newspaper article that you could find. You learned how to use indexes and you learned how to do that. It was a fairly time-consuming thing. And the whole focus was on that you wrote one 18-page paper for your grade by the end of the semester. And all of that work went into it. That same 18-page paper now takes seconds to write. And
Exactly.
it's referenced, it's well researched, all of that. So now one of the things that we've got to look at is, like, we've shortened the amount of time that we can create that kind of a resource. Now, how can we take that resource and meet the need effectively and in a way that is, satisfying to all parties? Those are the questions that we still have to answer.
It's interesting because if things are really shiny and flashy and moving really fast, I don't know if the current generation really understands what's happening or would be willing to give the time to it. And you could look at different kinds of movies or production, the way things are shot nowadays, it's like half second, 2 seconds tops. And
Yeah.
back in the old days, you'd have these long, rambling,
The monologue.
emotional, right, those kinds of things. So you just can't do things now in the way that we did it. We can't learn things now the way we used to. It's completely different.
What's really interesting, though, is that there seems to be a movement back away from that 2-second frame video concept. I mean, that was popular and has been popular now for the last 15 years or so,
Mm-hmm.
since the technology made it possible. But one of the things that's really interesting, and I kind of compare it to that in the food world, we have the real food movement. And the real food movement is a reaction to all of the industrialized processed food that's out there and the nutritional value of it and all of the health problems that are related to it, right? So one of the things that's really interesting is, yes, people pay more for real food, but there is a benefit in that. And I feel like that in the creative realm that I have a sense that one of the things that we're going to see is a real craving on people's parts, just like my son's craving to hear music as nicely as you can means that you buy a vinyl album for $35 now, and you play that on a machine that allows you to have an excellent quality experience. I have hope that he's going to see AI and go, nope, doesn't even compare.
Yeah,
Not
that's
even
probably
close.
true. Right.
Not even close. And that's just it. I think people still have the ability to discern. And I think that one of the things that's really at risk here is the mediocrity in any industry is probably first to be threatened by the technology, because the technology can do the job better. And we've seen that in every area, including graphic design, coding, imagery, illustration, and things like that, that it can do a better job than the mediocre people.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's still not doing breathtaking work.
I know you're right about that. A moment ago, you mentioned the real food movement. Does that have to do with the slow food movement, or does it have to do more with the lack of ultra high processed foods?
Slow food is related to that, and there's a lot of overlap between the two. The real food movement is the movement where you know the person who produces your food,
Hmm. Okay.
and you buy directly from the producer as much as you can, and you limit the amount of processed food that you eat.
Yeah, I would think so. The way I look at it as far as food, that can be the biggest poison or the biggest medicine that you could help yourself with or
Yeah.
hurt yourself with, depending on your choices. So I think that has a lot to do with it. I think getting things as locally based as possible, taking your time, which is what the slow food movement was about
Yeah.
getting back to doing this face to face, breaking bread, enjoying the experience, because families nowadays don't really do it. Everyone eats different food at different times and in a different number of seconds.
Yeah.
So it's not what, I think you and I probably grew up with.
Well, again, I think, we grew up in the industrial age when the TV dinner was the most breathtaking thing in the world.
Hmm.
And, on a Sunday night, you got your TV tray out, you watched The Wonderful World of Disney, and you had your Swanson's dinner. And that was considered breaking, cutting edge stuff at that time. What we
Right.
didn't realize was that the nutrients were being sucked completely out of whatever it was we were consuming. And so the body didn't know what to do with that food, set us up for some pretty creative illnesses that are still being dealt with in very strange ways. But I think, again, I'm looking at all of the things that where technology has been used to, tout a benefit. What we have found is that the human version generally is more desirable.
I heard something very interesting the other day about French fries at McDonald's contain something like 18 ingredients,
Yeah.
whereas French fries in my world contains three ingredients,
Yeah.
like avocado oil, potatoes, and
And
salt.
salt.
Um, so that's really all you need. So even something as simple and basic as French fries in our society is off the charts and is, I guess, hurting people's health to a major degree. And it's so innocent, and yet this is what's happening.
I think we've got to look at that the intention around processed food has been to increase the shelf life of it,
Hmm.
which increases the profits for the food company. So if you can keep something on the shelf longer, you can sell it for a longer period of time. And as a result, you can get more money out of what you've invested in growing it. So the intention behind it is to increase their profitability over time.
Right.
That doesn't take the consideration of the health of the consumer into any kind of regard at all.
So isn't it weird that you've got a big food that doesn't care about your health? You have big pharma, which is like all screwed up, and you got big medicine, which doesn't really know anything about nutrition. And it seems like they're all working behind the scenes to make us sick, but to keep us alive long enough so we can stay sick long enough to be able to put money in the pockets of the corporate types.
Well, again, I mean, we're talking about a complex here, and it's a multi-level complex that includes all of those. but they're all, when all is said and done, they're probably all owned by the same five people.
Right. Right. Are you feeling optimistic for the future, or are you kind of like middling right now?
I think that our future is going to have a real mixed bag for everybody. And there are going to be times when the whole thing collapses, and there are going to be times when it gets built back up again. And whether or
Hmm.
not we build better remains to be seen. But I have a feeling that we might be on the verge of one of those periods of time that's cataclysmic. And I hope that, I hope that my son survives it. I don't anticipate that I will.
Is he your only child?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. Do you think it would be fair to delineate life where we are right now as a post-COVID versus pre-COVID life? Whereas maybe 6 years ago, we didn't have COVID to blame anything on or to look at as that moment. So would you say that that's fair to look at life from that point of view?
It's interesting. Every generation has its marker. It's like the Vietnam War was a big marker for the people who grew up in the late boomer period. And then you've got the World War II in Korea for that group of people that were, in their prime during the 40s and 50s. And then you've got World War I before that and the Depression. All were defining moments for those generations. I think COVID is one of our defining moments, just de facto, because it affected everybody on the face of the planet.
Hmm.
And I do feel like that there is a before and an after kind of a thing that we can look at there. I think that it's easy to say that COVID was the main cause of all of these problems, but what's really the thing that we've got to look at is that it was the reaction to COVID that actually was problematic and not COVID itself. And the thing that we always have to look at is that after the disaster, our reactions are always predictable. There's always going to be that initial period where everybody's in the same boat. And then there are going to be some disagreements about how it was handled. And there are going to
Hmm.
be some disagreements about what needs to happen next. And then you've got the next level of whatever kind of conflict that happens in society that all got triggered by that. But that is such a pattern that you could probably say, oh, by this time, I expect that we're going to be arguing over, what so and so did about so such and such during the last part of March 2020 ruined the whole thing for everybody.
Yeah, yeah.
You know?
Well, personally speaking, for myself, I've seen my social circles shrink dramatically. It's
Yeah.
it's microscopic now. The amount of touch, physical touch, hugs, handshakes, things like that has
Oh yeah.
shrunk drastically. And I think that plays a big role in our mental health. And I can definitely blame COVID for a lot of that stuff because life prior to then was a little bit more warm and fuzzy and was more physical and was more about what I think most humans need is more of that touch.
I agree.
And it's interesting when they show studies on touch, it appears as though it's important in almost all cultures, but way less so in China than it is in America
Yeah.
when the scientists come out of the woodwork and they talk about these things. So sociology is a very important piece of the puzzle, I think, and I always trace it back to like these last 5 years being so different.
It has changed a lot of things. It has changed a lot of things. And again, especially for my son, I look at him and it's like it's a defining moment in his life. There hasn't been anything like that for him before that. Now, for our generation, we had the AIDS epidemic that influenced our behavior and our
Right.
choices back in the 80s, early 90s. Those of us who are of a certain age, we're on the probably the end of the Vietnam War or are old enough to remember the significant, conflicts around it and the social upheaval that surrounded that. Even I think one of the defining moments for my generation was Watergate because we
Right.
became a lot more suspicious of politics at that point than we'd ever been before. So we have those defining moments, and I think COVID is one of several for our generation. It's one of a few for our kids' generation.
Yeah, for me, one of the positives of COVID was that during that time, people were using delivery services to bring them food. And these delivery services are, for the most part, third-party delivery services. And there are a lot of similar addresses as mine, numerically speaking. And so many times during COVID, we had food delivered by one of these third-party company that someone else ordered, and it was dropped on our doorstep, and there was no name on it or real address. So I got to enjoy Thai and Korean and sushi and all these things I wouldn't have ordered on my own.
Well, and hopefully somehow or another, your neighbors were compensated for that, either with your food or.
Right, right, right. Well, not being a person who orders out, for me, it was like a great big bounty of deliciousness dropped at my doorstep. But no one was getting my food. Maybe they're getting some of my karma. I don't know.
Pennies from heaven, man. It's all good.
So, Franklin, is there anything that I haven't asked you in our little chat today that I should have and that you'd like to address?
Matthew, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I've enjoyed both of our conversations very much. And it just seems like that we can always find nice places to go and interesting, thoughtful places to go as well. So I welcome the conversation anytime you'd have me.
Oh, good, good. You would definitely have you back. Do you have any places that are in your strategy of where you might travel next?
Well, we are looking as a family on moving sometime in the near future toward the east coast of the U.S. Probably, we don't know yet, somewhere in Pennsylvania.
What is it about Pennsylvania that turns you on?
Proximity to family.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And where's the family? Hopefully not too close.
Well, my wife is from New Jersey, so
okay,
we're just we're trying to get closer to her family. My family's all out here for the most part, but we don't see each other very much, and there doesn't seem to be a real driving need to be located that close to each other.
I see.
We're just going to try it out. We'd also like to do some traveling, get it around. My son and my wife are looking at doing some European touring next year. I would like to spend, my dream is to spend a whole year in the UK in a more immersive kind of a way where I actually live there for a year rather than be a tourist. Tourism is not very interesting to me, but actually getting to know people and the way that they tick and what, how they live and all of that kind of stuff just is infinitely interesting. And the UK has always been on my list. I've always wanted to visit. I've got a lot of friends there, but I've never actually set foot there, except for one long layover in Heathrow doesn't count.
Oh, no, it doesn't. The slow travel, slow food, you see, it's making a comeback. And you know what? It is better to spend time in a place than to try to hit 19 cities in 3 weeks. That's impossible.
Yeah.
I went to school in the UK, in London. And so I was able to spend 3 years there and just totally loved it and been back several times.
Nice.
Yeah. Travel's real good. And before your wife and Sonny Boy go off to Europe, have them give me a ringy dingy and maybe I can give them some good ideas about some cities in Spain and in France and Portugal and places like that they should visit.
Awesome. I'll take you up on that.
And of course, a lot of the places that I'm going to talk about will be food related. So your wife will be happy about that.
What's really nice, she just set up a deal with a tour company next year in September of 2025. She is going to be going on a food tour in Italy, and it's going to be 3 provinces. She's going to be the host of that tour. So she's really excited about that. And
is that where they get a whole bunch of people together in a villa and they do the cooking and the cleaning and all that and then take side trips, day trips for the guests?
They are going to be doing day trips. She's actually not going to be teaching on that, except for maybe she might be doing some like side teaching and stuff like that. But the focus of it is to just experience the food and the beverages there, food and the wine, and that is the whole purpose of the trip. I think it's going to be a 10-day kind of a thing, and she's really just tickled about it and very excited. If anybody wants information about that, they can get in touch with me and I'll give them her connecting points because we don't have any landing pages up online yet for it. But
tell us how people could do that if they want to learn about that. I'm tickled to hear about this.
Well, the best way to get in touch with me on my blog, I've got a contact form, and that's like I check that more than I check my email. So that tells you I get a lot of traffic on that. And so it's the easiest way to find me, franklintaggart.com. And on the bottom of every page is a contact form, and you can use that to send me a note and just tell me that you want to know about Monica's trip to Italy.
Perfect. You know, before we say aloha, Franklin, I wanted to ask you about one of the blogs that I read that you wrote called I Suck at Relationships. Tell us what that means.
Well, I think one of the things that's really interesting about being a human is that relationships are necessary, but they're not easy. And what what's really interesting to me is that things that we need to know to have a good quality relationship don't seem to be wired into our behavior automatically. It's influenced by personality. It's something that's influenced by learning. And again, the things that we have been conditioned to believe about ourselves and about other people and about how we show up in the world, all of those things come into play. And I used to think that I was really good at relationships until just a few years ago. But one of the things that I realized that I was really good at pretending, and I didn't have very many real relationships. And that was a moment of a wake up for me. First of all, the thing that was really driving it was that I had a desire for real legitimate connection with people. And I had to come face to face with all of the different ways that I was showing up that were actually just really untrue and false. And they were all kind of strategies that I had learned at an early age to get approval from people.
Would
And
some of those
so
strategies fall under the fake it till you make it category?
I'm just going to say fake it. I had to really come clean with myself about all of the ways that I was lying. And not only to other people, but I was lying to myself about who I am and who I was. And that doesn't lead to authentic connection with people.
How did those realizations interplay with your marriage, or did they?
They certainly, I think that they have, in that I think I've tried to be somewhat more forthcoming with my real feelings rather than suppressing them and hiding them and pretending that everything is okay. It's also, I've had a tendency to not tolerate on the same level that I did before the same kinds of things in others. I challenge it a lot of times. I'm not going to say that I'm doing anything perfectly. God forbid. That's just not in my lexicon at all. But just that moment of realization of saying, you know what? I've always thought I was really good at relationships. I suck at relationships. And my relationships are, the very few that I have that I would say are good quality. I treasure those above almost anything else in my life.
Yeah. When someone does something that you cannot tolerate, do you call bullshit or do you just turn your back and walk away?
Depends on the level of trust that I have with that person.
Yeah.
There are some people that I'm really happy to call out, and there are other people that I'm just going to let them learn from their own experience and not intervene. And then there are other people that I'm going to say, is that really how you want to show up in the world?
You are willing to just let it go.
I can when I need to, and I've had
Hmm.
to. Um, I think for my own health and sanity, that's been important. And I think another part of it is that I've had to really look at, in my lying to people, there have been people injured by that. So there have been some places where amends need to be made. There have also been some places where I've just had to say, that person that I hated was actually really right about me at that moment. I just didn't want to hear it. So those kinds of realizations at this point in my life are probably the one link that I have between myself and sanity.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. That's why I keep mentioning your blog because I really think it would be very fruitful for people to check in and take a
Cool.
look at your blog and read some of your stories because they are so real, so about you.
Well, I think I'm about ready for another fit of writing and recording and stuff like that. So if you look on there and it looks like all that stuff is old, yeah, well, I haven't been priming the pump very much lately.
It's time. Whenever you're ready, we are.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me on 50 Tastes of Grey, Franklin. It was really awesome to catch up.
My pleasure, Matthew. Anytime.
Good. We'll do it again soon.
Excellent.